For show and tell today, I brought a Tibetan wisdom sword, also known as the Sword of Manjushri. You can tell by its stature and length, by the curvature of its blade, and by these flames, these bronze flames on its tip, that as a weapon, it is entirely useless. It has no value at all. But that's not its purpose. Its purpose is symbolic. It's here to remind us that all of the real enemies, the most challenging and most dangerous enemies we face in life, are internal. They're within us. They're not out there. The greatest threats that we face to our own well-being are within us. Things like self-indulgence, wrath, greed, lust, gluttony. In our Catholic tradition, we call them the 7 deadly sins, or the 7 cardinal sins. We don't talk about them much. I don't think we want to talk about them much, because I think we kind of like having them around. Who among us doesn't like a little gluttony and sloth from time to time? Now, I've been doing homilies like this for 17 years, and I often joke with my wife that you can tell how good a homily is by what time I get home. And if it's good, people want to talk to me. And if it's not, I'm home early. So on Saturday afternoons, I'm usually home from the 4:15 Mass by about 6, shortly after. Yesterday I was home by 5:30. And we had a baptism. Nobody wants to talk about this stuff. But it's in the gospel. We have to deal with it. One woman did. And people are taking wide berths, walking around me and kind of giving me this stink eye on their way out of church. But one woman walked up to me and she said, "Tell me again about that wisdom sword." So I told her, well, it's a symbol. It's just meant to remind us that all of the real enemies we face in life, the tough stuff, the ones that we really have to do battle with, are within us. And she leaned in, and in a very sincere and concerned voice, she asked, "Do you have a lot of those?" And I said, "Yes. And one is starting to stir to life right now." It's uncomfortable. We don't want to talk about this stuff. It's so much easier to talk about what's wrong with other people. People today are fill in the blank, People today are selfish. People today don't care about others. But we don't go through the process of replacing people today with I. I today can be selfish. I today can be callous and uncaring. We don't do that. The Pharisees didn't do it either. The Pharisees didn't want to talk about this stuff at all. In their mind, everything was about behavior. It wasn't about attitude or disposition of heart. It was about behavior, following the letter of the law with actions. And so they believed that the problem with everything and everyone was everyone else's behavior. And Jesus entered into a lot of conflict with them over this. And he kept calling them back to self-reflection. And we know the stories because they're peppered throughout Scripture. A woman caught in adultery, and he says, let the one of you without sin cast the first stone. It's a call to self-reflection. Before you go around pointing out the splinter in your neighbor's eye, take a look at that big old barn beam in your own eye. Calling to self-reflection. At one point in Matthew's gospel, he just comes right out and says to the Pharisees, he says, you Pharisees and scribes, you wash the outside of your cup and your dish, but inside you're filled with self-indulgence and greed, calling them to self-reflection about what's inside of them. And today there's no beating around the bush. He's talking to his disciples, he's talking to us. And he says, if you really want a chance at eternal happiness and joy and harmony and peace, you're going to have to do better than those Pharisees and scribes. You have to go inside. Said it's not enough to simply not kill people. You got to deal with the anger and the wrath that diminishes others. You have to deal with the anger and the wrath that breaks relationships. You got to deal with that. He said it's not enough to just not commit adultery. You have to have a heart that looks at every person with dignity and respect and sees them as people created in God's image. You got to go inside. It's not enough to simply go about your life and not lie. You have to be truthful about who you are in your heart. Be honest and authentic with who you are. This is hard stuff because it's so much easier to just follow the 10 Commandments. I got to be honest, I have never held up a liquor store in my life. Does that make me a great Christian? Does that make me on a path to wholeness and happiness for all eternity? And he says, no, you gotta go inside. You have to do a real deep dive into your own heart. And we don't want to hear it. And they hung Jesus on a cross for saying it. But the good news in all of this is we don't have to be perfect. Jesus doesn't ask us to be perfect all the time, to never have these feelings. He simply asks us to love one another. To love one another. But to do that, if we're really going to open ourselves to loving one another, we have to be honest and authentic with ourselves, about ourselves. If we're not, it gets really easy to be judgy. It gets really easy to judge others and see what's wrong with them and put up fronts and pretend there's nothing wrong with us. We're perfect, or at least we want people to believe it. But if we're going to enter into honest, loving relationships, we have to be honest and truthful about what's inside of us and do an examination of that. We have to be authentic about who we are, how we feel, and spend our lives growing toward that wholeness that Christ offers us. And may that authentic, loving wholeness of Christ rain down upon you. May that authentic, loving wholeness of Christ stir the heart within you. And may that loving, authentic wholeness of Christ flow forth from you.